Thank you, Geisha. That was an amazing 30-second or 10-second introduction. So thank you for having me, and it's really fantastic to see Disinfo Week become this incredible event in Europe after when I was at the Atlantic Council, did it together in the United States. So Geisha put me on the spot a little bit and asked me to do something I don't usually do because I tend to be an analyst and a researcher. But she asked me to tell you a story. And I thought I would do a personal experience. So instead of telling you about the toolkit, I want to tell you about how I came to personally experience the Kremlin's toolkit. So let's go back to 10 years ago. It's shocking to me that it was 10 years ago. And I was a graduate student at the time, interested in a really niche topic. And that niche topic was the rise of far-right political parties in Europe. Nobody cared at the time. My dissertation advisor told me, Alina, who gives a damn about this? Forget it. Nobody cares about Ukraine. Just go home. You're never going to get a job. This is a true story. So there I was doing research on trying to understand why we were suddenly seeing these populist movements emerge in Europe. And as I was finishing my doctorate, I started to notice something really funny. And I didn't know how to make sense of it. And what I started to notice was not just that these far-right parties were emerging because of domestic reasons in European countries, they seemed to start coordinating something with the Kremlin. So you have people like Marine Le Pen, leader of the then National Front, making a lot of visits to Russia, where she was received as a state leader, as the head of state, not as the leader of a fringe political party in France. And I started to see this network of political parties from the far right, and the Kremlin started to have a lot of meetings and coordinate their efforts together. And I thought, this is odd. Why are the Russians or the Russian government so interested in these relatively small political movements? And on the other hand, don't we tend to associate the Russian government with leftist, communist movements as the legacy of the Soviet Union? So what really accounts for this new relationship? So as I was looking into this, something else happened. So here we are in 2013, and all of a sudden, there's a massive democratic uprising in Ukraine against a corrupt government, and the Euromaidan revolution begins. I'm in the Swiss countryside at the time, where I was actually teaching at a university. And to go back to some of my research back in the day, I didn't mention that one thing I did as part of my doctoral work was that I spent about 2 years interviewing far-right activists in Ukraine. So I can't let my university let me do this, but somehow they said, hey, you're a young woman, you want to spend your time with neo-Nazis and far-right fringe groups, go ahead, just do your thing. So I did that for 2 years in Ukraine. I was really interested in trying to understand, why do people join these movements? So then Maidan happens, and I see some of these, you see some of these red and black flags on the screen. And yeah, those elements were there. The people I had spent time with for 2 years were there. But they were really, really fringe, small part of the movement. And I was there, I was going to Maidan a lot. And then my own mother called me. And we're from Ukraine. I was born in Kiev. And she said, Alina, what are you doing there? You have to get out. There's a fascist coup. This is a neo-Nazi government. You have to get out. And I thought, what's going on here? I'm here. I know that's not what's happening. Why does my own mother think that this is what's actually happening? And when I tell her the opposite, she's having a hard time believing me. So we can expect this kind of reporting that was coming out of the Russian state-funded media at the time, basically saying that the entire Maidan revolution, everybody knows the narrative, is a Nazi fascist coup, exactly what my mother has said. And I thought, what's going on here? Well, then I started looking into it a little bit more, and not was it only just RT, then some strange websites started pushing the same kind of narrative, right? Washington was behind the Ukraine coup, this is typical Kremlin narrative. And then, lo and behold, it starts to seep into some mainstream media. This is The Hill. It's a publication that's geared towards congressional staff and members in the United States, and this was an article they published. The reality of neo-Nazis in Ukraine is far from Kremlin propaganda. You have the NBC. U.S. cozies up to Kiev government, including far right. Again, at the time, the Russian state-sponsored media, not just RT, but Russian language media, was criticizing John McCain for meeting with some of the leaders of the new Ukrainian government, calling them neo-Nazis. Same narrative was being picked up in U.S. mainstream media. And then lo and behold, the BBC actually publishes a documentary film around, I think this was 2014 or 2015, called Ukraine's Far-Right Problem. Okay? I'm not going to play the whole thing, but you get the point. So, as this was happening, I started to realize that what was happening was a concerted and strategic disinformation campaign. And it wasn't just my experience. There was an entire system emerging where the strategy and the tactics were to try to poison our narrative, to try to seep into our mainstream media, and most Western journalists in the time bought into it. Why? Because there were no foreign correspondents in Kiev. They were all in Moscow at the time, and they're reporting on Kiev as to what was happening. What were they reading? To get their information, they spoke Russian. They were reading Russian media that was dominating the narrative. But, we started to learn, and we learned very quickly. So one of the first, you could say, counter-disinformation NGOs that emerged was, of course, in Ukraine for this obvious reason. So then we have Stop Fake. I know we have Yevhen, who started Stop Fakes here somewhere, started to do some of this debunking. There's a famous story that most of you probably know about, that Russian media made up a story, hired an actress, to say that the Ukrainian military forces crucified a little boy in a small town of Slavyansk. Totally made up. Stop Fake debunked it. And they debunked it very fast. And then many, many other NGOs and nonprofits and civil society groups started to emerge. The Baltic Elves, EU versus Disinfo, the governmental level, the Atlantic Council, working together with Bellingcat. So we started to pick up, we in the civil society space, and we started to respond. But what I learned very quickly was this was just the tip of the iceberg, the information warfare. So I started looking into this. What became very obvious is that there was money laundering, illicit finance, dirty money flowing through various networks into Western societies using Western financial institutions. Money laundering involving buying up real estate in places like London that's now being looked into very strategically and very concretely by the British government. Various types of real estate deals happening in the United States as well. The export of kleptocracy. And not just that, economic leverage as well. So the use of energy by the Russian government to try to gain influence and try to gain leverage within European societies especially. Nord Stream 2 is one of these political projects that is still ongoing. And cyber attacks. We all know about the hack and leak attacks that happened during the US elections, the French elections, but that's not the bulk of it. The reality is that the Russians have been testing various forms of cyber attacks on critical infrastructure systems in Ukraine. Ukraine has been a test lab. There's no accident that my interest in Russian influence began in Ukraine. The Russians have taken down electrical grids in Ukraine. They tried to take down Ukraine's financial systems. The country is basically under attack at all times. And what I realized was that this was all part of a bigger ecosystem, but not a beautiful ecosystem like this one. Kind of a dirty and gross and dark ecosystem, right? An ecosystem of influence that tries to use the elements of open societies, including open financial systems that can be manipulated for illicit financial purposes, for money laundering, including open communication systems that can be manipulated for disinformation campaigns. All of those elements of open societies that we've seen emerge as a byproduct of globalization over the last decades are now all being flipped and subverted for the use of malicious actors like the Kremlin. And it's still ongoing. And this is the key takeaway. We're talking a lot about election integrity, and as well we should. But that's only because the West only woke up to this because of Russian interference in our elections. The reality is that these are not one-off events. So elections provide a great opportunity for bad actors, especially the Russian government, who are trying to find a chance to get more eyeballs on the kinds of information warfare they're launching. So it's a great opportunity for some sort of meddling. But it's not the only opportunity. This was a search I did in the fall of last year during the Russian incursion into the Kerch Strait, where the Russian Navy basically took over and continues to hold hostage about 23 Ukrainian sailors in the Kerch Strait, the Sea of Azov. I did a search on Google for Kerch Strait. This is not a joke. And if you look at the top results I received, they're all from Sputnik and TASS, which is the Russian official state-funded media source. Why is this still happening in 2019? And there's many more examples of this. Obviously in the US elections, around the Skripal attacks. This was, I think, from a very recent EU versus Disinfo research. There have been 138 different stories from the Russian side about what happened with the Skripal attack. Anything to try to undermine and subvert the truth. This is a quick article from Politico. I think that you get the point. Elections are important, but they're not the only target of attack. They're not the only potential victim. And of course, it's all the entire space of social media, not just Google, not just Facebook, not just Twitter. It's the entire platform system, the entire infrastructure is being used in various ways to try to coordinate and amplify these kinds of false narratives. So we've done some things. We're catching up now at the governmental level. As you know, the EU has revealed its own action plan for fighting disinformation. That's a great start. The social media networks are doing some good things around political ads, around taking down various automated accounts. YouTube is trying to do some things, but as many here in the room, I see some familiar faces that have been doing a lot of work on this. They're still falling far behind. So at the national level, there's some great efforts, especially countries like Sweden and the Baltic states, but on the whole, we still don't have a grasp of the big picture, the entire toolkit. Because this is not just about disinformation, it is about illicit finance, it is about political influence and networks, it is about energy, and it is about cyber attacks. And this ecosystem is evolving. This ecosystem of influence is evolving very quickly. We're all talking about, the potential implications of AI, deep fakes, right? Audio manipulation, video manipulation that we're not able to detect. We haven't seen this technology being used in a sustained and strategic way by countries like Russia, but it's just a matter of time. And we're focusing on AI, but there are going to be many more emerging technologies that are going to start to hyperpower this kind of gray warfare. And the big question I have now, and to my own surprise, now I work a lot on tech, but it all makes sense, right? It all makes sense over the last 10 years how this happened to me, somebody who's tried to avoid tech as much as possible my whole life. But this ecosystem is evolving, and I think the question that I have for us, and that we are now only starting to grapple with at the very, very beginnings of it, is, are we? So thank you very much.
Great job. Fantastic. Okay, so now that we know, well, are we? That is a great question. Again, #DisinfoWeek. If you